Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Jess Garcia and I am the worship pastor here at No Abbey NoHo. I'm so happy you're with us. The scripture for today is Mark 16, 1 through 8. And the question for today is, what's one of the best moments in your life? The first thing that comes to my mind is my wedding day. Take a moment, press pause, think on it, and when you're ready, press play and enjoy the message by our pastor Darren McKenna.
Well, we did it. This is our final Sunday in the book of Mark. We are at what we know as the resurrection of Jesus. And what a ride it's been. We've been in the book of Mark since, I think, February. We've been working through it all year. And the reality is, I think so many of you have a better understanding and a better grasp at like the nuances and the complexities of this book than a majority of the other people that interact with this book. And I'm just very grateful that you all wanted to go on this journey with us through this book. So now we're at the final piece of the story. And again, it's the resurrection narrative. And I do want to say a few things is that we do have so much theology in Christianity around the resurrection. And around what that means spiritually, what it means ecclesiologically. And what I want to point us to is that Mark doesn't really get into that conversation very much. There's definitely some theologizing we can do about the book of Mark, but Mark's account of the resurrection is actually really short and very pragmatic. And it serves more as a function to end the story, to wrap it up, and I think to kind of get in that last little kind of point at what Mark is trying to do with his entire book. So I know we just read it, but we're going to be in Mark 16. I'm going to start talking through some of the verses in Mark, or in this passage, because there's a lot of little nuance and really fun things Mark is doing to tie up the story and to bring it to a close and set us on our journey. So, and also, we're going to be dealing just with Mark 16, 1 through 8. You'll see in most Bibles they have a little bit more after that. But we're just going with what the earliest manuscripts of Mark say, because I think it's more congruent and it ends the story in the way that it was intended to end. So, starting in the beginning of 16, we see Jesus's new inner three, the three women. The three women who were there at the end when Jesus was crucified. They are there, and they're showing their faithfulness. All the way to the end. So, like these three women end up being the paradigm for discipleship. With a little caveat here at the end of Mark, we'll see. But ultimately, they were going to the tomb where Jesus was buried to give Jesus the proper burial, the ceremonial burial that Jesus deserved. They were showing faithfulness. And one way we know it's faithful is that we have no idea how they were planning on rolling the stone away, right? They knew that that's how Jesus was interred. But they didn't care. What they knew they had to do is be faithful to the way that they believed that Jesus deserved to be treated in his death. And so when they get there, they see the stone is already rolled away, and they were surprised. And they look inside, and they see a young man in a white robe sitting on the right of where Jesus was. Now, that's some rich imagery right there, because you see, James and John were fighting about who would sit on the right hand of Jesus. And we see the disciples were all arguing about that. And ultimately, we get to the cross and we see at the right of Jesus is a revolutionary bandit, not James or John or one of the disciples. But now we have this young man, and it could be kind of calling back to the arrest story where there's a young man who randomly flees and who is wearing only a linen cloth and it fell down. And so he's running away naked. It's this weird little moment in the arrest story in Mark. So it is the same language in the Greek, but we're not sure. And I've had a hard time trying to draw a conclusion of what that connection might be. But what is interesting is this man is wearing a white robe. Which, yes, also, kind of reminds us of the white linen that Jesus was wearing. But more importantly, That white robe is the same language as talking about when Jesus transfigures on the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses and Elijah, right? There's this kind of like heavenly glorious kind of white robe situation that this young man has. And it's to bring us to one of those kind of more important and more fantastical and more spiritual moments in the ministry and life of Jesus. And it's in keeping in line with that, the text says, and they were alarmed. Well, that's the exact same language that it used with all of the crowds that saw Jesus come down from the Mount of Transfiguration. Like, it was apparently a very common reaction when you see whatever that kind of heavenly glorious situation is. It's also the language that Jesus uses, or that Mark uses, when Jesus is coming to terms with his own death. Jesus was very alarmed, deeply disturbed, right? So this is very powerful language, and it makes sense that these women would experience that when they come in contact with A, no Jesus, and B, heavenly white robe dude. That reminds us of the Mount of Transfiguration. And so, Mark, up until this point with the death of Jesus, right? Mark spends like an entire 2 or 3 chapters kind of drawing out the long process of the arrest, the suffering, and the death of Jesus, right? It's not a very quick narrative, but yet the entire resurrection is relegated to about 8 verses. And so what's interesting is Mark does a lot to kind of paint the end of Jesus, to say that, hey, Rome won. Hey, evil won. The death of Jesus is final. This is he's basically telling the reader, like, you should be very sad about what happened to Jesus. But there's a surprise here, because we see that Jesus is not in the tomb. This young man says he is risen, and he is going ahead of you into Galilee, and you will see him. This is meant to shock the reader. This is meant to kind of invoke some sort of like, wait a second, I thought you just spent 3 chapters talking about the death of this man, the end of this man, and now he's going ahead of me? That sounds so much like the beginning of all this whole story. And that's exactly it. You see, Mark is actually showing us that this story is more cyclical than it is final, right? That the story will begin again. He begins to open it back up, said, yes, the story had an ending, but the story begins again. And I'm sending Jesus, and Jesus is going ahead of you, and I'm sending you to go find him and go be with him. In the same way that John went before Jesus, and now Jesus goes before us. You see, this story of Jesus has a cyclical quality to it, that it happens over and over again. And we'll see that. I think that Mark is inviting us to be a part of that next cycle. And more importantly, Mark was trying to invite his readers to be a part of that next cycle. And we see it because the disciples and Peter are part of the restart. It talks about tell the disciples and Peter. I love how it singles Peter out there, because the disciples all abandoned Jesus in the arrest, and then Peter later betrays him extra when he's denying that he even knew who Jesus was. And you see, there's a restoration of the disciples. There's a bringing back and naming the difference in the ways that they deserted Jesus. So at the end, we have this surprise. You see Jesus standing up to Rome, doing all these dangerous things by trying to upend the social order and the religious order. And then surprise, Rome didn't actually win. Jesus actually continues doing the work that Jesus did throughout his entire life. But what's interesting is that Mark throws a really big curveball at the end. I'm going to read the text real quick. The young man says, go ahead of you, or Jesus is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. But then he says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So now, as we were talking about, the idea of them being afraid in this moment and being alarmed is pretty in line with every encounter that we've had with something like that, the Transfiguration, and even just all the way back through the Hebrew Bible. Whenever we see someone encounter God, it's met with fear. Whenever we see someone encountering an angel, it's met with fear. So their reaction isn't surprising. But we get a little bit of a curveball here. Because the end of Mark's narrative says that these women tell nobody what happens. These women just run away and flee, which, it's a little... This is interesting for me because the way that I've read this entire story of Mark, I see Mark showing these women to be the true disciples, right? They were second-class citizens, and they were the last, and now they are the first. They are the most faithful, and I think they are literally our exemplars of what it means to follow Jesus in the book of Mark. And then right here at the end, Mark has painted that picture of the entire book. It kind of flips that on its head yet again and says, well, they don't say anything. And there's a lot of commentary about this, and no one really knows why and how Mark. Clearly, we know they told someone about this by Mark's account because we have this story. So there's something that's off with this. And for me, I think the reason why Mark does this is because I think Mark is trying to provoke the reader to take up the mantle and to complete the story, or to, I should better yet say, to begin the cycle over again. He kind of leaves it in this, as he was closing down Jesus's life and it was seeming so final, with this surprise, like, hey, wait, his story's not over yet. Now what are you gonna do about it? Because this is on you. See, that's the way that Jesus was talking about his ministry the entire time, and this really does feel like some sort of device Mark is using to kind of incite a reader response that, hey, these women didn't say anything. I guess it's on me to say something now. We have to remember, this whole book is a socio-political commentary, and it's talking about the religious structures and political structures and systems, but it's also trying to tell people what it means to be a disciple and to follow Jesus. So it makes sense that the final thing that Mark is trying to do with this book is get people to get up and go do the work of following Jesus. You see, I think this is really important, and I love this story. I love how he ends this, even though it's really awkward and it kind of messes with how I understand literally the other 15 chapters out of the 16-chapter book. But this conclusion about discipleship and these women being the most faithful intersects with the story of resurrection. And I think when I read this passage, when I'm thinking about how Mark chose to close up his narrative with this, I feel like the message is for all of us to come alive, to be resurrected as well, to continue the story, to continue the cycle, or maybe even start the next cycle, the new cycle. See, I think Mark was very aware that what Jesus did was particular to Jesus's life and ministry. And I think Mark was also aware that the disciples would have a different ministry. And even knowing when he wrote it, he probably wrote this, 30-ish years after, 20, 30 years after the death of Jesus. So he saw the way that the church grew and changed in that time as he's writing this. And so I think he recognized that this is going to be a consistent cycle as we move through history and people playing different roles. So, in line with Mark in how he's closing this chapter and leaving so much room for what's going to happen in the future, my question is, what are you going to do? How are you going to come alive? I think the call for us is to take up the mantle of Jesus and the disciples, to be faithful like the women, to follow and serve and be the last, that we may also be first. And I was thinking through, what are the kind of marks of what it means to come alive, looking at them. When I look at the Markan narrative of Jesus, how do we know that we are truly alive and resurrected and transformed into this new life that Jesus wants us to live into. And I see three parts to this. And the first one of those is I see a call for us to wake up. We can't be alive, or we're not really fully alive if we're not awake. And Jesus was very keenly aware of the political and religious systems and the way that they impacted people. And he knew how to critique them and subvert them. Jesus was also aware of himself and what he was capable of and what his relationships were. And you bring all this awareness together, we're actually able to do something with that. We're able to be aware of how our neighbors are treated. We're able to be aware of the dynamics that kind of play behind the scenes in this world. And I don't really think we can be fully alive unless we fully wake up to that reality. And then, but more than that, I think the next step of coming alive is to live with purpose. And to borrow some potentially triggering language, but I think it's really powerful to live with the mission, right? I see a lot of intentionality in the way that Jesus lived his life. And I see a lot of intentionality towards justice. I see a lot of intentionality towards inclusion and showing mercy, and bringing people in and healing, right? There was a very definite focus of what Jesus was doing in his ministry. He was mission oriented. And I think the people that I know that have lived in the realest way possible, that feel like they really do have true life, that have come alive, understand their purpose in life as best as they can. Now that's going to change. It's not like there's one purpose. You have to figure that out. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But we can recognize the ways and the missions that we really do feel called to and step towards those with everything we do. Doesn't necessarily mean that you give up everything you have now to go pursue something separate. But my question is, what are the things that you have now, and how can you leverage those for a mission that you feel called to? This living with purpose, I think, is a huge part of being alive. But I also see one other piece of this in the ministry and life of Jesus. And it's that he honestly celebrated and embraced, at the very least embraced, humanity, his personhood. This book, if you've noticed, is a very human picture of Mark. Some people say that Mark has a very, what they call, low Christology, and that what we see more than we see Jesus' divinity, we see his humanity. And I think that's really important because that's very validating for our own humanity. Jesus was concerned about the actual physical needs of people and their futures. He was looking at the people on the margins and saw not only were they poor, but they didn't have hope for a future. Not only were they poor, but they didn't have social connection. Not only were they poor, but they weren't even healthy. And Jesus sought to right those wrongs in the world. I saw Jesus feasting and celebrating throughout the book of Mark, marking time, and with celebrating festivals and things like that. I see Jesus embracing exactly who he is and allowing people to splurge by pouring expensive perfume. And, again, he's living with the mission, but he didn't deny his humanity to do that. He fully embraced his humanity in all parts of himself in order to live out that mission. And so we at New Abbey NoHo, we're a Jesus community, and we're committed to the journey of healing, growth, and transformation. And we're doing all those things. Like we're being healed to become better humans. We're growing we're growing as humans, and we're transforming into whatever our true selves are. And by doing that individually, we help our communities do the same. We help our communities come alive and have some vitality to them. Maybe our communities that we're a part of, whether it's this one or other ones, that they would be aware. Maybe they could have a missional purpose to them. Maybe they will celebrate humanity and treat everybody in that way. I believe that part of the Jesus story is so central, that coming alive is what we're called to do. When we're free to embrace all of our humanity, all of the ups and downs and the weirdness, we're free to embrace other people's humanity. And we're free to pursue justice, but for us, but for everyone else. And we're free to provide healing. We're free to include people because we recognize that there are many parts to them that deserve care and attention and celebration. So this is what it means to be alive. We have to be awake. We need to be mission oriented. We need to celebrate our humanity. And this is what I think the book of Mark is inviting us into. And that's my call today. How are you coming alive? That's the question I want to ask us. That's what I want us to talk about in our groups. How are you embracing your humanity and the humanity of your neighbor? How are you living with purpose? How are you waking up? I think these are the kinds of questions that when we look at the entire life of Jesus, I think these are the kinds of questions that get evoked for me. And I want us to start answering those questions as a community. Because we need to be able to support each other in our lives and in the ways that we feel called to come alive and live into the fullest reality of our true selves. I believe this is resurrection life. You've probably heard that term before, but maybe it's had different connotation. But when I think of the resurrection as the possibility of the story beginning again, I see that even though so many of us have experienced some kind of death, there's the possibility of beginning again. And that's really, really, really good news to me. And maybe in that beginning again, in that next part of the cycle, we're more awake. Maybe we have a different mission or a purpose. Maybe we represent or we recognize and affirm different parts of our humanity. And all of those are good and beautiful things. Now, I recognize this is 2020 and I'm preaching in my bedroom for safety reasons. And it's going to be really hard right now for some of us to know what coming alive looks like for us. And I want to say that's okay. But I do think that there probably are some things that we can hold on to, even if it's hard to believe that those things could make us alive. I do think we all have something that we can access even in a time like this. So I want us to go back into our groups and ask the question, how are you coming alive these days? Or what real life is happening for you? Are you waking up? Are you doing justice? Do you have a mission? Do you celebrate your humanity right now? Where are you in all of those questions? So let's go back into our group and we'll have a conversation about that for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and discuss as a larger group.
Thank you for joining us. Follow us on Instagram at New Abbey NoHo. And if you're interested in giving to New Abbey NoHo, feel free to head over to www.newabbey.org/generosity. Be sure to scroll down to the North Hollywood Fund. Thank you, and have a blessed week.